So, Gill Kernick is going to bring another emotional moment to us. She has a personal story that she's bringing. She used to live in the Grainful Tower for 3 years, and then she moved out, but she lost 7 of her former neighbors in the fire. Gill now works as a master consultant with J&J Associates, and they help organizations to create leadership and culture that prevent accidents. And Gill's particular passion is about major accident prevention. As I was reading up on Gill for today, I could have gone on for days. She has an admirable and inspiring CV, and she's very generous in sharing all of her knowledge on her blog. So she has a blog. She's also written a book, which is called, sorry, that's the one I forgot. Catastrophe and, yeah, help me please. Catastrophe and Systemic Change. Yeah.
Great.
Welcome, Gill.
Thank you. Thank you. So, firstly, it is wonderful to be with 3D human beings. It's the first time, actually, since I published my book that I've spoken live. I've done a lot of presentations on Zoom. So while the topic is not something that makes me happy, being with you in person is delightful. And just to say that Esbjerg is close to my heart. I have worked here a number of years ago with Maersk Oil, so it's wonderful to be back. If you see, I'm wearing a green heart, and on the green heart are 72 stars, one for each of the people that died in the Grainful Tower fire, my former home. And I'm sharing with you today and talking to you today inside of a promise I made as I watched the tower burn. A promise that we'd learn, that something like that would never happen again. And my intention is threefold. Firstly, I hope you find it interesting. So I imagine in Denmark, you don't know much detail of the Grainful Tower fire, so I'm hoping to, it'll be interesting for you. Secondly, I hope that you will realize how far ahead of many other industries oil and gas is in thinking about major accident prevention. So in my experience post-Grainful and sharing with people about my experience of major accident prevention, people just don't know the mindset that we have. We don't have it all figured out. There's way more to go. But I do hope that during the presentation, you realize how far we've come as an industry, particularly around major accident prevention. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, I hope that you have some insights and will take some actions after both my presentation, after Challenger, and throughout the day that will help move us towards goodness. So that you're not just sitting here over the day, taking in information, and then go back and keep doing what you were doing before. That you actually have some insights, perhaps speak up about something that's been concerning you, perhaps listen to somebody that you haven't been listening to, so that we can all help prevent the devastating suffering of tragedies such as the Grainful Tower fire. The speaker is not working, so hold on 1 second and I will be back because it's not working. Ah, there we go, okay. So what I'm going to do is share with you both my own story and a professional lens. So Grainful is both a personal and professional story for me. I'm going to share about my memory of living in the tower, and then I'm going to talk about what happened on June the 14th. And then talk about closed doors and despair as I learned about the multiple failed opportunities to learn as we see in all major accidents, as we've just seen with Challenger, and also the scale of the problem. So Grainful was not an isolated incident. There's multiple unsafe buildings across the UK. And then I'm going to talk about insights that I've had about change, and I want to end on grief and hope. So firstly, to memories. So in 2011, I just moved back from living abroad, and my husband and I wanted to live in North Kensington, which is sometimes called Notting Hill. It's the home of the Notting Hill Carnival, Portobello Market, which many people that have visited London will know of. This is my favorite part of London. I adore that part of London. We weren't ready to buy an apartment, so we wanted to rent for a couple of years. And I've never considered living in a high-rise building, but I was sick of looking at these dingy, dark, massively overpriced basement apartments with no light. And I was looking through the paper at available apartments, and one caught my eye. And it was on the 21st floor of Grainful Tower. So went to look at it and literally walked in, looked at the views, turned to the estate agent and said, "Where do we sign?" It is still one of the most beautiful apartments I've ever lived in. That picture is actually of the sunsets. It was famous for the sunsets because of the positioning of the building. You could see just these exquisite, exquisite sunsets. Dual aspect windows, large, just wonderful. But the other thing, so I fell in love with the views, but the other thing I fell in love with was the community in high-rise living. And particularly on our floor, there were 3 families with kids, and the kids used to play in the lobby. And then we used to sometimes leave our door open, and you know what kids are like, they'd kind of get curious, and then they'd run inside, and then they'd see us, and they'd squeal, and they'd run out again. So my memories really are of the views, the community, and the sounds of children playing. And then in 2014, we'd so fallen in love with high-rise living that we bought an apartment nearby, and our view is and was of Grainful Tower. That is it before the fire. So up until 2014, that was just a wonderful sight. So I lived there, saw those lights, and it was fond memories that it reminded me of. And then the 14th of June. So I was struggling to sleep. So I was lying down in our living room, and there were a lot of helicopters. But London, that's not so unusual. So sirens and helicopters in the middle of London is not so unusual. So I didn't think something bad's happening. I was just like, there's some drugs or gangs or something happening somewhere. Didn't think much of it. And then got up to walk into the bedroom, and walked in the bedroom, and that's what I saw, is my former home on fire. And I particularly remember the diagonal flame, which you can see there, this bright diagonal flame. But at the same time, my professional interest kicked in. So obviously it was horrifying watching it. But I immediately started thinking of other disasters, and particularly Piper Alpha. Don't know why, but particularly Piper Alpha that night and the next day. And little did I know that there were many similarities. So both on Piper Alpha and at Grainful, they'd made refurbishments that led to them becoming less safe. And also in Piper Alpha, the people that survived were the people that defied the policy not to jump into the sea. So it was said that if you jumped into the sea, it would mean certain death. But the only people in Piper that survived were people that actually jumped into the sea. Likewise, in Grainful, and I'll talk about this a bit later, there was something called a stay put policy. And the people that survived were the people that defied the stay put policy and left the building. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, in my non-technical way, what happened that night. I will show slides. I'm not going to talk through every single detail of them. So the slides are not like a talking point. They'll add a little bit more picture to what I'm saying. You don't need to read them all, but if you kind of spot something and it catches your eye, great. So just to say, I'm not going to use them as talking points. They'll add pictures and a little bit more context to what I'm talking about. So the first thing that happened was they added cladding, both for aesthetic reasons, but also environmental sustainability. So I think there's something for us to be conscious of about additional risks that we're adding inside of sustainability that I think we're not always aware of. For example, EV batteries, et cetera, et cetera. But they decided they were going to clad the building. They cladded in something called an ACM cladding material, which had aluminium panels and then a polyethylene core. So I'm not an engineer, but apparently polyethylene is like petrol. And the way that they attached it to the building was they bent the cassettes, so the polyethylene core was exposed. And it was hung on metal rails, which then enabled pooling of the polyethylene as it melted and dripped, which again created more ignition source for the fire. Interestingly, they had decided not to do what's called a riveting, where they could have put it directly onto the building. Instead, they did this hanging it onto the metal rails, which actually was more expensive, but less safe. So that was one of the decisions that they made. And the cladding and polyethylene was the cause of the major cause of the spread of fire. So that's the first thing that they did. They also moved the windows outwards to sit flush with the cladding. And around the windows, there was no cavity barrier. So even though regulations stipulate that there needed to be a cavity barrier to protect against fire getting through around the windows, none was present either in the design or the building itself. And the windows were surrounded by flammable materials. So the quote up there is from one of the expert witnesses in the Grainful Tower inquiry, saying that if there was a fire anywhere near a window, it was almost inevitable that it would get into the cladding. And then another distinguishing feature in Grainful was something called the architectural crown. So it's purely aesthetic. It was covered again in the ACM cladding, curled into fins with a lot of exposed polyethylene core. And there are a lot of facade fires around the world. What happened in Grainful is quite unique in terms of it engulfed the whole building. And it's thought that the crown played a major part in that, because once the flames got to the crown, it spread horizontally around, and then the polyethylene dripped and started fires further down the building and ended up engulfing the whole building. So the consequences were, there was a very small fire. So the original fire, which was in a fridge freezer, which, again, interestingly, in the US, the regulations are to have metal backing, and in Europe and the UK, it's plastic backing. So but part of the question is, if there'd been metal backing, would the firefighters have had sufficient time to put out a very small fire, the size of a waste paper basket? So the fire started, and obviously any building should be resilient to a fire that size. It's not a massive fire at all. Within 15 minutes, it spread up 19 floors, and the materials just fed off one another at every point. There was just more place for combustion to happen. Compartmentation in high-rise buildings is the fire should stay within the compartment or apartment of origin. So the whole firefighting strategy relied on compartmentation working. Stay put relies on compartmentation working. But it was broken even before the firefighters got into the kitchen to fight the fire. It had melted the UPVC, so the heat of the smoke was sufficient to melt the UPVC, and then it could get through the windows and directly into the cladding. And once that happened, the spread of the fire was inevitable. The stay-put strategy, as I said, relied on compartmentation working, and we've seen that was broken at 1:14, but it was only changed as a strategy almost 90 minutes later, when a high assistant commander for the fire brigade arrived and said it's untenable, we need to get people out, at which point they flooded the building at great risk to the firefighters and did manage to rescue some people. There were a number, as with all major accidents, a number of other internal control failings. So fire doors and fire closers weren't present. So fire doors are meant to resist fire for 30 minutes. The ones in place resisted for 15. They should have had automatic door closers. A lot of those were missing. So particularly in the flats where the fire first spread up, all of those people got out of their flat. They might not have got out the building, but they got out of their flat. But many of those doors were left open. And that enabled the spread of toxic smoke into the communal areas. The single source of fire escape, no requirement for sprinklers in a historic building. New builds, yes, but in historic buildings, no. The firefighters propped the stairwell doors open, which meant that smoke got into the single evacuation. There were problems with ventilation. There should have been what's called a firefighting lift, which gives firefighters particular abilities to go up and down the building. There wasn't one present. But even then, the firefighters couldn't override the existing lift, which meant they couldn't use it to carry material up, but also couldn't stop residents using it. So at least 3 residents are thought to have died trying to escape in the lifts. And then there was a dry riser, not a wet riser. So that means that you don't have water quickly available, so it delays the water getting to the source of fire. And then interestingly, flat numbers. So I lived in flat 185, and when I lived there, it was on the 18th floor, and there were 6 floors on every flat, and you knew your floor number by your flat number, so there was between 181 to 186 on the 18th floor. But in the refurbishment, they added 3 stories at the bottom, residential apartments in 3 stories at the bottom, and changed the floor numbers. But they didn't change all the labeling. So in the stairwells, not all of the labeling had changed, which again obviously leads to problems with orientation. So the conditions changed rapidly throughout. There is evidence that anybody at any time could have gotten down. That's expert evidence that said there was never so bad that you couldn't have got down the stairs, but there were very big psychological barriers. Thick black smoke, and I'll show you a video in a second, and also what's called a hot zone. At some point, we think because the doors were left open, between the 13th and 16th floor, there was this hot zone. And it caused people from high up the building trying to escape to turn around and go back up. So I'm going to show you about a 30-second video of one of my former neighbors, Marcio. So he is at this point in his flat with his wife, who's 8 months pregnant and asthmatic, his 2 daughters, his neighbor Helen, and her daughter. So 3 adults, 3 children, and one of the adults is pregnant. And they're trying to decide whether to try and get down. And this is what he saw when he opened the door.
Why are you crying? Why are you crying? You are crying.
So that is what people would have had to walk into to get out of the building. So the results, I'll let people read those. This is a picture of Marcio. So they started something that's the first time they've done it in the UK, which is doing pen portraits of the victims as part of the official inquiry to bring the people into the picture. And this is, Marcio was actually the first person to give a pen portrait. And this is to his unborn son, who was stillborn at 8 months, Logan Isaac, so the youngest victim of the fire. And he showed that picture as he was giving his pen portrait. Marcio obviously got out. There's an extraordinary account of his escape because he happened to be on the phone with the control room as the fire came into the flat. So he was on the phone with the control room. Literally, the fire came in. So there is a recording of him escaping down the building. And I went to the inquiry the day that he was giving evidence where he spoke through every part of the recording. And it's still one of the, I think probably the most harrowing thing I've ever heard. Because when he gets to the bottom, he thinks he's lost everybody. So his kids are further up and he can't find them. And he can't see his wife. And the anguish of a father's voice, thinking that he's just lost everything, is beyond words. But Marcio did get out. They lost Logan Isaac. And he is a phenomenal, brave campaigner for change. The Al-Wahhabis also lived on our floor, so Marcio's girls used to play with the Al-Wahhabi kids. They all died. So they were one of the families that tried to escape and then turned around and came back up and all died in the flat. What I remember about them is their smiles, especially Yassine. So he was 20 when he died. He used to come and borrow our bicycle pump. And he was, we used to chat in the lifts. He was really interested in business. He was 20 when he died. Abdulaziz's sister also lived in the tower on a different floor, and she got out. So she watched and tried to call and spoke with her brother and watched the fire, and her brother died, and she's now a really good friend of mine. So originally, I was quite hopeful because as much as it was painful from my work, I know that catastrophic events can also be a catalyst for change. So while it was devastating, and as I watched the fire, I promised that I would do whatever it took to learn, I was actually quite hopeful. But then I found out more things. So I remember the moment I read this. This was a select committee, so a government committee hearing in 1999. The fire happened in 2017. So the primary risk, therefore, of a cladding system is that of providing a vehicle for assisting uncontrolled fire spread up the outface of the building. They didn't change the regulations after that. Multiple failed opportunities to learn. I'll talk about one in particular. So there's a fire called the Lachnal house fire. 6 people died. External spread of fire. One of the findings was that the regulations governing fire, which is called Approved Document B, were unclear and needed to be relooked at. That hadn't happened by the time of Grainful. Secondly, the picture there is of a woman by the name of Catherine Hinkman. She was told that firefighters would come and rescue her, and they never got to her. So part of the findings was not to give people false hope. If you don't know that a firefighter is going to get there, don't tell them that someone's coming. And that lesson wasn't learned in Grainful. And Marcio, for example, said if he'd known that nobody was coming, he would have made different decisions at earlier points. And then in 2016, so the year before Grainful, there's even a London Fire Brigade presentation on facade fires, because there's been a number globally. At Grainful, it's thought a maximum of one person had seen that presentation. So the risks were known. I am incredibly defensive of the firefighters there that night. I think they were put in an impossible situation. I'm less defensive of those in power in the fire brigade. But the firefighters that night I have incredible respect for, but there were massive failings. And it was found that stay put had become an article of faith. So there's no other option but to implement and keep in place a stay put policy. They didn't have in their planning and preparation an up-to-date plan of the building. They didn't have an evacuation plan if stay put didn't work. And then at the incident ground, obviously stay put, failings in command. And again, we see this in major accident after major accident after major accident. And failures in physical and electronic systems. They were writing flat numbers on walls, and they didn't have numbers for people to call back. So it was really, there was massive failings in terms of the systems they used. And then in the control room, the fire survivor guidance calls, not saying to people, we don't know if somebody's coming, which we think contributed to people dying. And then also communications with the incident ground. Interestingly, in the control room, that night they were in a temporary control room because they were refurbishing the proper one. And in the temporary one, there wasn't a big screen. So the control room people couldn't see how bad the fire was. So we were all watching it on the news, but the control room operators didn't have a sense of the fire. So in the inquiry, which is ongoing, predictably, and everybody's blaming everybody else, it's a complex supply chain. Everybody's saying it wasn't us, it was somebody else. There's not one person that seems to have done their job at all across the whole gambit. And there is this massive, value engineering, so why the cladding was changed was originally zinc, was to save 300,000. It's a value engineering exercise. And great corporate scandal. So the manufacturers of both the cladding and the insulation knew it was dangerous and gamed the testing systems, and because the regulations were weak in the UK, chose to go ahead and sell knowingly dangerous products, which has led to what it's led to. But for me, the most heartbreaking is the failure to listen to residents. So this is a blog, again, from 2016, so just before the fire. That's a picture of Eddie Stefan, so he got out the fire. He's a big campaigner now. But it is our conviction that a serious fire in a tower block or similar high-density residential property is the most likely reason that those who wield power at the managing company will be found out and brought to justice. But the residents' voices were silenced, so people called them aggressive and rebels. They blocked the blog so the people in the managing company couldn't see that blog because they were seen as problematic for raising their concerns. And the problem's not limited to Grainful. So 4 years after Grainful, it's estimated it'll cost between 15 and 50 billion to make buildings safe. There are 455 buildings with the same cladding. Only 158 have been remediated. We don't know how many buildings have other types of unsafe cladding, but it's thought that it might be 25%. So there have been applications for up to 3,000 buildings for a fund. And there's multiple other failings with fire doors, cavity barriers, as they're looking into other residential properties. And this has had a massive impact on the property market. So it's thought that 1.3 million flats are unmortgageable. So they're rated as valueless because of fire safety defects. And leaseholders, the most innocent parties who bought their flats in good faith, are bearing the cost, both of mitigation and then increased insurance costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're stuck in flats and can't move, sometimes with kids, and some of them are having to pay for remediation costs as well. 23% report having thought of self-harm or suicide. And the near misses continue. And globally, we see this increasing trend. And in the last 2 weeks, there have been 2 big facade fires, one in China and one in Milan. No one's died in those, but we have to think that we're living on borrowed time. So, to seed planting and change, it felt like everything I knew about change was redundant. So I knew how to create change with leaders and organizations willing to look at themselves in the mirror, up for change, and here I was in this massively political context where people literally were not interested. I had a CEO of one of the organizations at the heart of it, I can't say which one it is for confidentiality, tell me, Gill, nobody is interested in learning. I met with somebody that works close to government. He said to me, nobody in government wants to learn. It's a far better strategy to push things under the carpet than actually be interested in learning. So I needed to relearn and rediscover what change was if I was to fulfill my promise. And I was very lucky to be mentored by and work with Jim Weatherby. He's a former NASA astronaut who I think's actually spoken at this conference. And one day Jim said to me, the doors of the people you should be talking to will likely be closed. Stop knocking on them and look for the open doors. And that literally changed my view of change. I stopped doing what I thought I should do and just started planting seeds and seeing what would happen. And met amazing people, ended up hosting a multidisciplinary conference at Cambridge because I wanted different voices. I thought not one single person knows the solution here. And ultimately that led to writing this book because Diane, who's my editor, is the head of the Bennett Institute at Cambridge University. So I'm going to share about a couple of thoughts I've had about change, because I realized I had to shift from thinking about what are the lessons from Grainful to asking why don't we learn? Because predictably, we will identify all the lessons from Grainful and we will fail to learn them. So another bad thing will happen and we'll look back and we'll go, oh yeah, we missed all of these opportunities to learn. So I had to switch to this question, why don't we learn? And one of the big, the key points that I make is I think we have a piecemeal versus a systemic focus on change. So we focus on fixing small parts of the system. We look at what's wrong with it, we look at technical solutions, we assume the world's predictable and controllable, and we do need piecemeal change, but piecemeal change doesn't create systemic change. For systemic change, we need to think differently. We need to think about shifting the conditions that are holding problems in place. We need to look at what's the system perfectly designed for rather than asking what's wrong with it. We need to understand the world is complex and emergent and not controllable. We need to bring leadership that is based, organic, emergent, that's based on values and principles. And we need to use the knowledge of all stakeholders, the tacit knowledge and experience of all stakeholders, and not only rely on traditional expertise. So I'm going to tell you a parable, because then I was like, okay, well, how do you create systemic change? What do I do after that insight? And there's this parable. There's 2 fish swimming along, And the one fish says to the other one, how's the water? And the other fish replies, what's water? So one of the things from a systemic change perspective is you literally need to make the water visible. So what I set out to do was to answer this question, why does our failure to learn make sense? And then created what I call the Grainful model for systemic change, which looks at governing and operating frameworks, so looking at our foundational structures and behaviors, which are obvious, but then also the more obscure, the relational elements, the contextual elements. And what I did was explore myths, conditions holding things in place, and opportunities to disrupt, to try and make sense of our failure to learn. In Grainful, this is kind of like what I think are some of the contributing factors. So you see the refurbishment, but then there's all the stuff happening on government, and there's all the stuff happening within organizations. And when you put it into this model, it maps like this. And you will see throughout the day, I was even listening to Challenger, you will see many of these things present in Challenger, and throughout the day, you'll see these issues repeat themselves over and over again. So, what I believe is one of the things that we should be doing is debunking myths. And some of the key myths is that regulations guarantee safe outcomes, or policies and procedures guarantee safe outcomes. We know that they don't. I think this audience, we know they don't. In other audience, they go, Gill, you're kidding me. Doesn't regulation solve everything? In the UK, the response to Grainful is create 2 new regulators. Don't fix the regulations or the current regulators, create 2 new regulators is one of the responses. Secondly, and I do this in the book looking at the Boeing 737 MAX disasters, is this myth of the perfect error-free world. So we have to move away from the world is nice and controlled and perfect, and then sometimes this bad apple does something stupid, and then, world order is restored. And again, this audience, you'll understand that. And then finally, thirdly, the myth that softer relational issues aren't that important. And Nippon this afternoon will talk about the Costa Concordia, which again is an example that I use. And then finally, that you can create systemic change without shifting context. And the example there is the Hillsborough disaster was a stadium disaster where 97 people died. And the first response was to blame the victims. So they were drunk hooligan footballers. And it took the families fighting for 30 years to get that overturned. And there was a huge cover-up by both the police and the media. So this notion of unaccountable power in big institutions and governments needs to shift. So if I look at what do I think are the conditions holding our failure to learn in place, I think there's massive issues with governance and accountability. In this context, we work with very complex supply and delivery chains. Who's actually accountable? And I think we keep that blurred. And that, I think, is a condition that holds our failure to learn in place. We are obsessed with blame, and in governments, we're also obsessed with blame avoidance. So governments will take nice, easy strategies to not upset anybody. So there's both blame and blame avoidance. The other condition holding things in place is a failure to rebalance power. So the continued failure to get the voices at the front line heard, for example, is one. And then a lack of political intent or will to do what's needed to actually create meaningful change. And then what I think are the opportunities to disrupt. So I think one of the opportunities to disrupt is to increase our capability to deal with complexity and ambiguity. The world's not getting simpler. It doesn't follow a simple set of rules. We need to expand our capability to deal with complexity if we want to disrupt the status quo. We need to ensure fairly borne consequences. So in the case of Grainful, the people that are paying are the leaseholders. The developers, the government, no. the leaseholders. So we have to ensure fairly born consequences. We need to tap diverse and distributed knowledge. We need to welcome diverse views. We need to become better at arguing, at challenging, at being safe, getting into divisive, difficult conversations. And finally, we need to create safe spaces to explore deeply held assumptions and beliefs so that we can actually talk about what's keeping things in place. So I'm going to end on grief and hope. So I'm a different person than I was before the fire. And I always say there's this line of grief that connects who I was and who I am now. But it took somebody saying to me, "You're not grieving," for me to firstly start grieving and secondly take care of my mental health. So it's been, have been in therapy since about 6 months after the fire, will probably continue to be forever. I struggle. I found work very difficult. I found it very isolating and very lonely. And why I'm sharing that is because we're coming out of, or who knows, we might not be, a pandemic where millions of people have died. And I think that organizations really need to step into the space of mental health and supporting people in what I think is probably going to get worse over the next 6 months, 2 years. We're seeing it already a lot in the UK with kids and teenagers. So that's really why I'm sharing that with you. I think there's a process of grieving that's important, but also how organizations support people with this. I want to talk about the disruptive power of kindness. So what I missed a lot was people just being kind to me. You know, it's just being kind. And I see that a lot in my local community, but I miss that a lot in certain other places. And this is a quote from Eddie, who I spoke about earlier, that he gave at the Grainful Tower inquiry, where he said, in response to a question, what could they have done to prevent it? He said, they didn't treat us with respect or empathy or humanity. And if they had, I wouldn't be sitting here now. And I often wonder if treating one another with respect, empathy, and humanity is not one of our biggest accesses to preventing catastrophic events. And then where I found hope. So one of the brilliant things with the world the way that it is and with digitalization is actually we all do have a voice. And I think that hope lies in all of us. It lies in our ability to speak up, to take steps towards goodness, to create people around us that are committed to change and to work together to accomplish that. It lives in really step-by-step moving towards goodness and preventing more suffering. So my question to you, I'm going to send you on a break in a minute, a half-hour break. So I do my moderator thing there. So we're going on a half-hour break shortly. My request is that you think about, where are you not using your voice? Where are you not listening? What can you do to help us move towards goodness? And at the break, go and look at the exhibitions, but also maybe chat about that, or at least reflect on that personally. I'm going to end by reading this quote, which is one that keeps me going when I want to give up and stop speaking and stop fighting, and when I have people trying to silence me. It's the quote that keeps me going. And this is for you. And therefore all must, I believe, wrestle with the profound moral obligation to shout from the heart, perhaps quietly and gently, with tears of reluctance, perhaps with fierce fire and angry wisdom, perhaps with slow and careful analysis, perhaps by unshakable public example. You must speak out to the best of your ability and shake the tree and shine your headlights into the eyes of the complacent. Speak out with compassion, or speak out with angry wisdom, or speak out with skillful means. But speak out you must. And this is truly a terrible burden, a horrible burden, because in any case, there is no room for timidity. The fact that you might be wrong is simply no excuse. You might be right in your communication, and you might be wrong, but that doesn't matter. So thank you very much.